Tonight, a lullaby will disarm the most dangerous man in the city. It's not a weapon, but a simple folk song, sung by a live-in nanny to a motherless child in a $20 million penthouse. He listens from the shadows, a crime lord who governs an empire with violence, and feels a fracture in his own guarded heart, a tenderness he thought he'd erased years ago. This is the story of how the most vulnerable sound in the world became a threat to his entire existence. Her name is Amara. She is 26, a trained childcare specialist hired to soothe a grieving little girl named Chloe. His name is Elias Vance. He is 32, a man who built a financial syndicate through ruthlessness and is now a widower failing as a father. This is not a love story. It is a collision. What happens when the one thing designed to heal a child becomes the only thing that can shatter a hardened man? And what does a man like that do when the source of his greatest weakness is living under his own roof? Amara took the job for the silence. After 2 years in a crowded Newark foster care agency, the Vance penthouse with its floor-to-ceiling windows and hushed marble halls promised a reprieve from other people's chaos. The salary, 5 times her previous one, was for discretion, not just skill. The agency briefing was stark. Chloe Vance, age 4. Mother deceased 18 months prior, a sudden aneurysm. Father, Elias Vance, absorbed in his business. The child had stopped speaking in full sentences. She had night terrors. 3 nannies had resigned in the last year. The 4th was fired. Amara saw the unspoken words. The father was the real problem. Elias Vance's world was built on 2 pillars. The first was visible. Vance Capital Group, a boutique private equity firm specializing in distressed assets. He was the wunderkind who'd bought failing shipping logistics companies and strip-mined them for parts, a brutal efficiency that earned him a fortune and a profile in Forbes by age 28. The second pillar was subterranean. Federal investigators, according to sealed affidavits we've reviewed, believed Vance Capital was a laundering front for a sprawling syndicate that manipulated cryptocurrency markets and ran high-stakes illegal gambling rings from Macau to Manhattan. He was a ghost in the financial system, a man who could ruin a competitor with a keystroke and, allegedly, make a person disappear with a phone call. His wife's death had not softened him. It had vacuum-sealed whatever humanity he had left. Amara's first day was an exercise in eerie stillness. She was shown to her suite, a room larger than her entire last apartment, by a curt house manager. She met Chloe in the sun-drenched playroom. The little girl was a porcelain doll with her mother's curls and her father's piercing, watchful eyes. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, she just stared. Amara didn't push. She sat on the floor, started quietly assembling a wooden puzzle, and simply said, "It's okay to just be here." For 3 hours they sat in silence. It was the first rule of her training. You cannot force trust, only create a space where it feels safe enough to emerge. She didn't see Elias Vance until that evening. He returned home at 8 p.m. Amara heard the secure elevator chime, the firm footsteps on the hallway marble. He appeared in the doorway of the playroom, still in his tailored suit, his tie perfectly knotted. He didn't look at his daughter. His eyes, a cold, flint gray, landed on Amara. "You're the new one," he stated. It was the same tone, she imagined, he used to address a subordinate or dismiss a proposal. "Report any issues to Mr. Halstead, the house manager. You do not contact me directly." Then he was gone. The interaction lasted 12 seconds. Chloe hadn't even looked up from her blocks. Amara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the penthouse's perfect climate control. This wasn't a home. It was a beautifully appointed vault. The routine established itself. Elias was a specter, leaving before dawn, returning late. Amara and Chloe existed in their own bubble. Slowly, painstakingly, Amara worked. She used picture cards. She read stories with dramatic voices. She baked simple cookies, filling the sterile kitchen with the scent of vanilla, a sense memory she hoped might trigger something. After 2 weeks, Chloe handed her a block instead of dropping it. A week later, she pointed to a picture of a dog in a book. Small victories, monumental in that silent world. Then came the first night terror. A blood-curdling scream ripped through the penthouse at 2:17. Amara was at Chloe's door in seconds. The girl was thrashing in her bed, caught in a nightmare, screaming for a mommy who would never come. Amara did what instinct and training dictated. She gathered the small, trembling body into her arms, sat in the rocking chair, and began to hum. It wasn't a song she'd planned. It was an old Gullah lullaby her grandmother had sung to her in Charleston, a melody that had crossed an ocean, borne by ancestors who soothed their children through unspeakable fear. The words were a soft, rhythmic promise in a language of survival. "Hush now, child, the moon is watching. Nothing here will bring you harm." She didn't hear the door creak open. She didn't see him standing there, backlit by the hallway sconce. Elias Vance had been working in his study down the hall. He'd come to silence the disturbance, to assess a breach in his home's controlled environment. What he saw stopped him cold. His daughter, who flinched at his touch, was curled into Amara's shoulder, her breathing slowing. And the sound, it was a raw, unvarnished tenderness that had no place in his world of calculated risks and silenced enemies. It was a vulnerability so profound it felt like an attack. He stood there, undone, for a full minute before retreating into the shadows. The next morning, everything changed. A formal note was waiting for Amara at the breakfast table, delivered by Halstead. It was on thick, cream-colored Vance capital letterhead. "Your hours are extended. You will take all meals with Chloe in her quarters. Your access to the West Wing terrace is revoked. Your personal phone must be surrendered to Halstead during working hours. A dedicated landline will be provided for emergency use only." The list went on. The gilded cage had just had its bars reinforced. The message was clear. The intimacy he witnessed was a security flaw. It needed to be contained, monitored, controlled. But that was the external reaction. Internally, something else was shifting. Elias began to find excuses to be home earlier. He'd appear in the doorway of the playroom, not speaking, just observing. His analyst's mind, trained to detect weaknesses in balance sheets and tells in opponents, was now fixated on this new variable, the nanny. He had Junho, his head of security, run a background check. It came back clean, almost suspiciously so. Amara Green, 26. Top of her class in early childhood education. Foster care system from age 9. No criminal record. No significant relationships. A life of service and solitude. To Elias, a man who dealt in secrets, a spotless record was a record that had been carefully curated. Who was she really? The tension built like atmospheric pressure before a storm. Amara felt his eyes on her constantly, a physical weight. It wasn't the predatory hunger she'd nervously expected. It was something more unnerving, a deep, unsettling curiosity, as if she were a complex equation he couldn't solve. One afternoon, she found a brand new first edition copy of her favorite childhood book, The Snowy Day, sitting on the playroom shelf. No note. When she mentioned offhand to Halstead that the preschool-grade clay was too hard for Chloe, a delivery of premium, soft modeling clay arrived the next day. They were benevolent gestures, but they felt like surveillance trophies. He was learning her, and in his world, knowledge was the precursor to control. The cliffhanger arrived on a rainy Thursday. Amara, seeking a moment of privacy, took her personal phone to a small, disused linen closet to call her old mentor from the agency. She spoke in hushed tones about Chloe's progress, about the strange, oppressive atmosphere of the home. She said, "It feels like I'm being studied under a microscope. He's not a father, he's a warden." What she didn't know, what she couldn't possibly have known, was that Elias Vance had the entire penthouse wired for audio. Every room except the staff quarters, a standard security precaution for a man with his enemies. As she spoke, he was in his study, listening to the raw feed in real time. He heard her call him a warden. He heard the fear and frustration in her voice. And for the first time, Elias Vance, a man who built empires on cold logic, felt something hot and irrational ignite in his chest. It wasn't anger, it was betrayal. She saw him clearly, and she was afraid. His hand hovered over the intercom button to summon Halstead and terminate her employment immediately. But then he remembered the lullaby, the impossible tenderness, the way his daughter finally slept. His finger moved away from the button. He had a new, more dangerous plan. If she thought he was a warden, he would show her just how tightly his world could close around a person. She wanted to observe. She would become the subject. Her every move, every breath, would now be cataloged not just for security, but for his own consuming, inexplicable need to understand the source of that damnable, disarming song. The surveillance didn't tighten like a noose. It softened like a trap being lined with velvet. The morning after Elias heard her call him a warden, Halstead delivered a new memo, this one handwritten on a simple note card. Miss Green, given Chloe's progress, I am revising the protocol. You will join us for family dinner each evening at 7 p.m. It is important for her to see normalized social interaction. It wasn't a request. It was a decree. That night, Amara sat at a table longer than her old foster care dormitory, between a silent little girl and a man who watched her cut her salmon as if it were a complex surgical procedure. He asked questions. Not personal ones, not yet. He asked about her educational philosophy, about Piaget's stages of cognitive development, about the efficacy of play-based learning versus structured curricula. He was interviewing her, but the subject was her mind, not her resume. Amara, flustered, answered professionally. Inside, she was screaming. This was worse than being ignored. This was being consumed in slow motion. The dinners became a nightly ritual of exquisite tension. Elias would dissect her opinions, challenge her methods, all with a detached, analytical calm. One evening, discussing Chloe's fear of the penthouse elevator, Amara mentioned a technique called gradual exposure. You identify the smallest step of the feared activity and master it before moving on, she explained. Elias put down his wine glass. And what is the smallest step for overcoming a fear of powerful men? He asked, his gray eyes locking onto hers. The air vanished from the room. Amara froze. Chloe, oblivious, dropped a pea on the floor. Elias didn't blink. He was waiting. Amara finally managed. I wouldn't know. I've never found professional authority to be fearful, Mr. Vance. A lie so transparent it hung between them like smoke. He gave the faintest nod, a scientist recording a data point. Of course, he said, and the conversation moved on. But the line had been crossed. The professional boundary was now a battlefield. Meanwhile, cracks began to appear in Elias' impenetrable empire. A rival syndicate, the Lucian Group, was making aggressive moves on his West Coast gambling operations. An encrypted message intercepted by his security team, Junho, warned of a possible mole within Vance Capital. The pressure that usually fueled his focus now scattered it. He'd be in a tense video conference negotiating a hostile takeover, and his mind would drift to the way Amara had tied Chloe's hair into lopsided pigtails that morning. The image was an absurd, distracting vulnerability. He found himself pulling up the penthouse's security feeds not for security, but to watch her read a story. He was becoming compromised, and in his world, compromise was a fatal flaw. He tried to counter it by doubling down on control. He had Junho deepen the background check. They found nothing damning, only a pattern of quiet resilience that somehow irritated Elias more. Who was this woman with no leverage, no hidden debts, no exploitable secrets? Amara, for her part, began her own quiet investigation. The excessive security, the whispered phone calls Elias thought were private, the way certain business associates looked more like enforcers than bankers, it all painted a picture. One afternoon, while Chloe napped, she used the dedicated landline to call an old friend from college who now worked for the Financial Crimes Division of the District Attorney's Office. She posed a hypothetical, careful not to use names. What would it look like, she asked, if a private equity firm was a front for something else? How would you know? Her friend, sensing her fear, said, you'd see shells within shells, money moving between holding companies with no real assets, employees with skills that don't match the business, like a logistics expert who's really a forensic accountant hiding transactions. A cold realization settled in Amara's stomach. She'd seen Halstead, the house manager, reviewing complex spreadsheets. She'd overheard him mention offshore liquidity to a visitor. She was living inside the machine. The pivot point came from an unexpected source, Chloe. The little girl blossoming under Amara's care began to speak in full sentences. She started calling Amara Mara, the closest her tongue could get. And one night during a terrible thunderstorm, instead of crying, Chloe padded out of her room, past her father's study, and straight to Amara's door. She didn't go to her father. She went to her source of safety. Elias, working late, saw it on the monitor. He watched his daughter push open Amara's door, saw Amara wake instantly and gather her into the bed without a word, resuming the soft humming of that damnable lullaby. The sight carved something hollow out of him. It was proof of his failure as a father and evidence of her profound success as a caregiver. The jealousy was immediate and volcanic. He wanted that trust, he wanted that peace, and he wanted the woman who provided it. The next day he crossed a new line. He canceled his meetings. He appeared in the playroom mid-morning, still in his home clothes, a simple black sweater that did nothing to soften him. "I'm observing today," he announced, "to better understand the routine." He sat in a chair too small for him, a king on a nursery throne, and watched. He watched Amara guide Chloe through letter tracing, her patience infinite. He watched her negotiate a tantrum over a blue crayon with a calm firmness that was somehow gentle. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the steadfastness in her posture. This wasn't just an employee. This was a person of immense substance, and she thought he was a monster. The need to prove her wrong, to make her see asterisk him, became an obsession. That evening after Chloe was asleep, he cornered her in the kitchen. She was washing a sippy cup, her back to him. "You're afraid of me," he stated. Amara's shoulders tensed, but she didn't turn. "I'm cautious, Mr. Vance, there's a difference." "Is there?" He moved closer, his voice dropping. "You told your friend I was a warden. You think this is a prison. You think I'm the jailer." Amara spun around, her eyes wide with shock and betrayal. "You were listening." "This is my home," he said, as if that explained everything. "Every sound, every whisper belongs to me." The power dynamic was naked now. Amara felt a surge of defiant anger. "Then you heard everything. You heard that Chloe is thriving despite the atmosphere here. You heard that I care about her. And you heard that I find the man who ignores his grieving daughter to be the most terrifying thing in this $20 million fortress." She expected fury. She expected to be fired on the spot, thrown out into the night. Instead, Elias did something astonishing. He looked away, a muscle ticking in his jaw. When he looked back, the cold analyst was gone. In his eyes was something raw, something lost. "I don't know how to do this," he said, the admission ripped from him. "The business, I know that world. It has rules. This fatherhood, it's a language I never learned." The vulnerability was so shocking, so utterly disarming, that Amara's anger evaporated, replaced by a dangerous pity. This was the crack in the glacier. And she knew, with a social worker's instinct, that this was the most vulnerable and volatile moment of all. A man like Elias Vance didn't show weakness, ever. The fact that he had to her meant she was now irrevocably entangled in his psyche. He had handed her a weapon, the knowledge of his inadequacy, and trusted her not to use it. It was a terrifying form of intimacy. From that night, the dynamic shifted into a dangerous symbiosis. Elias began to ask for her advice, not just about Chloe, but about trivial things: what book to buy, what color to paint a spare room. He was constructing a bizarre, parallel reality where they were co-parents, partners in the project of Chloe's healing. Amara, trapped by her love for the child and a growing, horrified fascination with the man, played along. She found herself noticing the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he'd rub his temple after a long call. She caught herself wondering about the wife who died, about the man he might have been before the empire hardened him. This was the blurring of boundaries the research warned about, the emotional labor that transformed a worker into a confidant, a therapist, a pseudo-partner. She was being absorbed. Then the external world crashed in. Junho intercepted a credible threat. The Lucian group, tired of corporate warfare, had sent a clearer message. A photo of Amara and Chloe walking in the private building park, taken from a long lens, delivered to Elias' encrypted server with a single line. "Every empire has a soft underbelly. How pricey is yours?" They had targeted his weakness. And they had correctly identified it, not as his daughter, but as the nanny who made his daughter a vulnerability. Elias' reaction was not fear, but a cold, focused rage that turned the penthouse into a command center. Security details were tripled. The building's entire surveillance system was hacked and upgraded by his team within 6 hours, but his most revealing order was given to Junho privately. The woman, Amara, is now priority alpha, above all other assets. You protect her with your life or you lose yours. Do you understand? Junho understood. The nanny was no longer just an employee. She was the central pillar of the Vance Empire's stability, and Elias, whether he admitted it or not, was no longer just protecting an asset. He was protecting the first person who had looked at his failure and not turned away in disgust. Amara, sensing the new tension, confronted Halstead, who finally broke his facade of servitude. "Miss Green," he said, his voice low, "there are things in motion. Mr. Vance's business has attracted undesirable attention. You and the child are now factors in a larger equation. My advice, do exactly as he says. His methods are extreme, but they are effective. He will not let harm come to you." "Why?" Amara pressed. "Why does he care?" Halstead met her gaze, and for a moment she saw the former Marine he once was. "Because you hear the song, Miss Green. In this house, for years, there has been no music. You brought it back, and for a man who has lived in silence, that is a reason to go to war." The bridge to the next catastrophe was built in that moment of stark clarity. Amara finally saw the full picture. She was a pawn in a criminal war, the emotional keystone for a damaged little girl, and the unwitting object of a dangerous man's obsessive, fragile redemption. She couldn't run. Chloe needed her, and the Lucian group was watching. She couldn't stay. She was losing herself in the gilded, monitored prison, so she made a decision. If she was a factor in the equation, she would become a variable Elias couldn't control. She would use her access, her newfound, terrifying intimacy with the jailer, to find the evidence that could bring his empire down. Not for vengeance, but for freedom. That night, as Elias paced his study formulating a counterstrike against his rivals, Amara Green, the nanny, began her own silent operation. She memorized passcodes glimpsed over shoulders. She noted the times the security feeds cycled. She identified the one room in the penthouse even Halstead seemed to avoid: Elias' private, biometric lock study closet. She knew whatever could free her, or destroy her, was behind that door. And she knew the only way to get the code was to get closer to Elias Vance than anyone had ever been. The hunter was now being hunted from within his own fortress, by the one person he had begun, against all reason, to trust. Amara's investigation began with tenderness. It was the only weapon she had that he wouldn't see coming. She leaned into the role of confidant, asking Elias quiet questions about his day, offering a listening ear that was neither frightened nor judging. She learned his tells. The slight pinch of his thumb and forefinger meant a deal was souring. A slow blink meant he was lying. And the way his gaze would drift to the framed photo of his late wife, Lillian, on the bookshelf when he spoke of before, that was the raw nerve. Amara would gently steer conversations toward Lillian under the guise of understanding Chloe's history. "What was she like?" she asked one evening as they shared a nightcap after Chloe was asleep. Elias, usually so guarded, took a long swallow of whiskey. "She was light," he said, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. "She laughed at my intensity. She called this place the mausoleum and filled it with terrible abstract art just to watch me pretend to like it." He fell silent, then added almost to himself, "She would have known how to help Chloe, I don't." In that moment, Amara saw not a crime lord but a grieving, lost man. The dissonance was paralyzing. Was he a monster or a victim of his own making? Her mission to destroy him now felt like kicking a wounded animal. Her first real breakthrough came from a mistake, his. In a moment of distraction, irritated by a market alert on his phone, Elias typed the 6-digit code to his private study closet into the keypad while Amara was ostensibly arranging flowers on a console table behind him. Her reflection in a polished silver vase captured the sequence: 927416. She memorized it, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The code felt like a live wire in her mind. She waited 3 agonizing days for the right opportunity, a window when Elias was at a mandatory board meeting and Halstead was occupied with a security briefing downstairs. The closet was a climate-controlled vault. No files, no cash. Just a single, sleek laptop on a stand, and on the wall, a large, intricate flowchart drawn on what looked like architects tracing paper. It was a map of his empire, but not the legitimate one. This was the nexus. She saw the connections. Shell companies with names like Marlowe Holdings and Triton Logistics feeding into a central node labeled VCG Alpha, which then branched out to entities in Macau, the Cayman Islands, and Switzerland. Arrows pointed to photos of men, some politicians, some known faces from organized crime briefings she'd seen on the news. At the very center of the web was a small, scanned photograph of Lillian Vance, smiling. It was a shrine to his motive. This entire shadow empire, this dangerous life, was built for her asterisk, or perhaps because of her asterisk. Amara used her phone to take rapid, shaky pictures of the chart. As she turned to leave, her eye caught a red line drawn through one of the entities, Lucian Group West, with a handwritten note in Elia's precise script. Asset acquisition pending. Containment protocol L9 active. He wasn't just defending against the Lucian Group. He was planning to annihilate and absorb them. She was standing in the brain of a predator. The wait, it gets worse moment hit 48 hours later. The Lucian Group, tired of corporate chess, made their move. It wasn't a direct attack, it was a precision strike. As Amara and Chloe returned from the building's indoor playground, a friendly-faced woman in a delivery uniform approached them in the lobby. "Package for Vance residents," she said, holding out a tracked tablet for a signature. The moment Amara reached for the stylus, the woman's grip tightened on her wrist. Her smile never wavered as she said, voice low, "Tell your boss his harbor deal in Manila is dead. Tell him the next package won't be a tablet. It'll be in a smaller box, for the child." She released Amara's wrist, handed her a real package containing expensive chocolates, and walked away. The threat was visceral, personalized. They hadn't just threatened Chloe, they'd threatened Chloe asterisk through her asterisk. Amara's hands trembled so badly, she could barely hold Chloe's hand on the elevator ride up. She told Elias immediately, showing him the security footage Junho pulled. He watched the exchange, his face a mask of granite. When it finished, he didn't rage. He simply said, "They've made a strategic error. They've shown me which of my assets they value most as leverage." His eyes met Amara's. "You." That single word hung between them, charged and terrifying. His protection detail on her doubled. He gave her a panic button bracelet linked directly to Junho. But the most significant change was that he stopped pretending this was just business. He started briefing her. "The Lucian Group wants the Manila port because it's the key to a new synthetic drug pipeline," he explained coldly, pointing to a map on his screen. "I control it through a local partner. If they get it, their revenue triples. This isn't about sending a message anymore. It's about extermination." Amara was now a reluctant soldier in his war, privy to secrets that made her a target not just as a pawn, but as a witness. Her internal conflict reached a fever pitch. The evidence on her phone was a ticket to freedom. She could walk into the DA's office and potentially bring Elias down. But doing so would leave Chloe defenseless in the middle of a gang war and likely get herself killed by the Lucians, who now saw her as Elias' weak point. She was trapped in a pincer movement between two criminal empires. The only path forward was through the man at the center. She made a desperate, calculated gamble. That night, she didn't just play the confidant, she became one. She found him in his study, staring at Lillian's photo, a glass of amber liquid in his hand, looking more isolated than she'd ever seen anyone. "Talk to me," she said, sitting in the chair opposite him without being asked. "Not about business, about her, about the silence after." Elias looked at her, and for the first time she saw no calculation, no analysis, just exhaustion. What he told her reshaped the entire story. Lillian hadn't just died of an aneurysm, she had been investigating him. She'd stumbled upon the darker side of his operations, the part he'd kept hidden to provide the safe, beautiful life he thought she wanted. A heated argument followed. She called him a criminal, he called her naive. She left the penthouse upset, got into her car, and crashed on the Henry Hudson Parkway. The official cause was a sudden medical event. Elias, his voice hollow, confessed he would never know if the aneurysm caused the crash, or if the stress of their fight of her discovery caused the aneurysm. "I built a cage of money and power to keep her safe," he whispered, "and the bars are what killed her." His grief was fused with guilt, and that guilt had calcified into the ruthless, expanding empire Amara saw on the chart. He wasn't just a criminal. He was a man trying to outrun a ghost, building a monument to his sin so large it would finally eclipse it. This was the pivotal revelation. The dangerous man undone by a lullaby wasn't just softened by tenderness. He was a guilt-ridden soul subconsciously seeking absolution. Amara wasn't just a nanny or a pawn. In his fractured psyche, she had become a stand-in for the jury he feared and the forgiveness he craved. Her mission to expose him now felt morally catastrophic. How do you destroy a man who is already in hell? The Lucian group answered that question for her. They bypassed security entirely. They didn't send an enforcer, they sent a subpoena. A process server, flanked by 2 federal agents, was waiting in the building lobby the next morning. The documents were not for Elias, but for Amara Green. She was summoned to testify before a federal grand jury investigating Vance Capital Group for racketeering and money laundering. The FBI had been building a case for years, and they had finally pierced his armor. They'd found their way in through his new, unvetted, emotionally vulnerable employee. The agent in charge, a woman named Reyes, pulled Amara aside. "We know you're in over your head," she said. "We know about the threats. Testify about what you've seen inside that penthouse. The security, the meetings, the flowchart, and we can put you and Chloe in witness protection. You can be free of him and of them." It was the escape route she dreamed of, but it came with a price, becoming the instrument of Elias' destruction. Elias' reaction to the subpoena was a masterpiece of controlled fury. He didn't blame her. He saw the move for what it was. The Lucian group had fed information to a Justice Department informant, manipulating the federal investigation to remove his protection of Amara, leaving her vulnerable and him distracted. "They are using the full weight of the United States government as a weapon against me," he said, a grim respect in his tone. "It's almost elegant." He gave her a choice, one that was no choice at all. "You can testify. The information you have is substantial. It would likely result in my indictment." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "Or you can refuse, citing personal safety. I will have my lawyers tie the process up for months. But if you refuse, you declare yourself my ally in the eyes of both the government and my enemies. There is no going back." Amara stood at the precipice. One path led to a new, hidden life built on betrayal. The other led deeper into the gilded cage, now with the door locked from the inside by her own hand. She made her decision, not in that moment but later that night when Chloe, awakened by a nightmare, didn't call for her nanny or her father. In her half-sleep, she murmured a single blended word, "Mara Daddy." The unconscious fusion of her 2 guardians broke Amara's resolve. This child had already lost one mother. To tear apart her world to send her father to prison would be a second, unforgivable abandonment. Amara couldn't do it. The next morning, she told Elias she would not testify. The look he gave her was not triumph, but something akin to awe. He had expected rationality, self-preservation. He had not expected loyalty. It was the one currency he couldn't manipulate or buy. In that moment, the last professional barrier between them dissolved. They were now accomplices. The transition into the endgame was sealed with a kiss. It wasn't planned. It was in the kitchen, amid the tension of the looming legal battle as they debated strategies over coffee. He reached out to move a strand of hair from her face, his fingers lingering on her cheek. The touch was electric, a current of pent-up everything. She didn't pull away. He leaned in and she met him halfway. It was not sweet or gentle. It was desperate, a collision of 2 people clinging to each other in a freefall. When they broke apart, breathing heavily, the world had rearranged itself. The nanny and the crime boss were gone. In their place were Amara and Elias, bound by secrets, danger, and a terrifying, undeniable need. He rested his forehead against hers. "I will fix this," he vowed, his voice raw. I will end this war, and I will build something new, something clean for you, for Chloe. It was the promise of a man offering his future as a down payment for her faith. Amara believed him. And that belief was the most dangerous thing of all. The final act would not be about escape or exposure. It would be about the terrifying cost of redemption and whether a man like Elias Vance could ever truly buy his way out of hell, or if he would simply burn down heaven and call it home. Elias Vance's war was not fought in back alleys with guns, but in boardrooms and on servers. The promise he made to Amara in the kitchen became his blueprint. To end the external threat, he executed what financial analysts would later call a hostile pacification. He didn't crush the Lucian group. He made them an offer they couldn't refuse, constructed from their own secrets. Using the intelligence gathered by Junho, Elias exposed the Lucian patriarch's eldest son to the SEC for insider trading, creating a massive public liability. Then, through a series of shell companies, he bought up the Lucian group's staggering debt at a discount. He owned them. The offer was simple: stand down from all aggression, cede the Manila port interest, and he would not call in the debt or release the evidence that would send the heir to prison. It was a checkmate that looked like a partnership. The threat to Amara and Chloe evaporated overnight. The delivery woman was never seen again. The war ended not with a bang, but with a signature on a restructuring deal. The federal investigation, however, was a more delicate problem. You cannot buy the Department of Justice, but you can redirect it. Elias, in a move that shocked his own lawyers, requested a meeting with Agent Reyes. He walked in without counsel and made a proposition. He would provide detailed, corroborated evidence on 3 larger international syndicates the FBI had been chasing for years, syndicates that made the Vance operation look small-time. In exchange, he would receive immunity for past nonviolent financial crimes for himself and his key personnel, and the subpoena against Amara would be voided. He presented it not as a deal, but as a trade, his knowledge for their closure rate. He also presented something else: a forensic accounting report commissioned by an independent firm that began the process of legally separating his legitimate assets from the legacy shadow operations. He was voluntarily dismantling his own empire. Agent Reyes, initially skeptical, reviewed the evidence. It was a gold mine. The case against Elias Vance for racketeering was put on indefinite hold, designated supplemental to primary international targets. Amara was officially removed as a person of interest. She was free. With the external fires contained, the real work began, the internal reconstruction. Elias was a man of his word. He sold off the volatile, illegal arms of his business. The gambling operations in Macau were transferred to a rival, cleanly severing his ties. The money laundering pipelines were shut down, the accounts closed. He refocused Vance Capital Group on legitimate distressed asset turnaround, the thing he was actually brilliant at. It cost him nearly 40% of his net worth and most of his dangerous connections. His world became smaller, quieter, and infinitely more vulnerable. He did it for them. For Chloe, who needed a father, not a phantom. For Amara, who needed a man, not a myth. Amara, in turn, did not retreat. She renegotiated her contract. She was no longer just the nanny. She became the director of home and family, a formal title with a formal salary that recognized her role as the emotional architect of their lives. She established boundaries, no more surveillance in the private quarters. Elia's study closet was dismantled, the flowchart burned in the fireplace. She demanded and received a seat at the table for all decisions regarding Chloe's education, health, and well-being. She was not his employee. She was his partner in the project of their unconventional family. The power imbalance didn't vanish, but it was acknowledged, negotiated, and constantly recalibrated. They attended family therapy. Elias, the master negotiator, found himself routinely outmaneuvered by a 4-year-old and a child psychologist. The love that grew in this new space was not a fairy tale. It was a deliberate daily choice. It was Elias learning to read a bedtime story, his voice awkward at first, then softening. It was Amara learning to navigate the lingering shadows of his world, the occasional threatening letter from a dispossessed former associate that Junho would quietly handle. It was arguments about school districts and the ethics of private security. It was Elia surprising her by funding a pilot program for her idea, a nonprofit called The Harbor, providing transitional housing and childcare for women leaving foster care and abusive situations. He didn't just write a check. He used his logistical genius to help design the program's structure. It was his way of honoring her past, of building something clean from his tainted wealth. A year passed. The penthouse, once a mausoleum, began to feel like a home. Chloe, now 5, spoke in excited, run-on sentences. She had a father who attended ballet recitals, his phone left firmly in his coat pocket. She had Amara, who was her constant, her North Star. The night terrors became rare, then disappeared. The lullaby was no longer a tool for survival, but a song of comfort, requested sometimes just for the joy of hearing it. The final surprising detail came on the anniversary of Lillian's death. Elias had always visited her grave alone. This year he asked Amara to come with him. They stood before the elegant headstone, Chloe placing a small, clumsily picked dandelion beside the formal flowers. Elias spoke, his voice thick. "I loved you, Lily, and my love for you became a prison. I'm learning to love differently now, not as a fortress but as a harbor." He then reached into his pocket and placed a small, smooth stone on the grave, a river stone. He turned to Amara. She collected these on hikes. She said they were proof that even the hardest things could be worn smooth by persistent, gentle forces. He took Amara's hand. "You were my persistent, gentle force." In that moment, the last ghost was laid to rest. He wasn't replacing Lillian. He was finally making peace with her, freeing himself to love Amara without the poison of guilt. The documentary's central question, what does a dangerous man do when tenderness becomes his greatest weakness, found its answer. He doesn't destroy it. He doesn't weaponize it. If he is brave enough and if the tenderness is strong enough, he lets it dismantle him. He submits to the gentle wearing down of his own sharp edges. He trades his empire for a family. He exchanges control for connection. Elias Vance chose to be worn smooth. We end not with a wedding but with a quiet evening. Chloe is asleep. Elias and Amara are on the terrace, the city lights twinkling below. No grand declarations are needed. The proof is in the peace. The lullaby, the simple folk song that disarmed the most dangerous man in the city, still echoes in the halls, but now it's part of a chorus, of laughter, of argued bedtimes, of a future being built, day by careful day. Amara did not find a hiding place in that penthouse. She found, against all odds, a home. And Elias Vance, for the first time since he could remember, was not listening from the shadows. He was standing in the light, finally found. So what do we make of this story? Is it a romance, a redemption arc, or a stark illustration of a power imbalance so profound it can only be resolved through near-total surrender? The tale of Amara and Elias lives in that uncomfortable, compelling gray area. It forces us to ask difficult questions. Can a person born from corruption truly build something clean? Or does the shadow of their past simply lengthen and change shape? The real-world context, as our research showed, makes this narrative even more complex. Over 2 million domestic workers in the United States, mostly women of color and immigrants, navigate these intimate power dynamics every single day. For them, the employer romance trope isn't a fantasy. It's a potential trap that obscures very real vulnerabilities: isolation, legal exclusion, and the blurring of professional and emotional lines. Amara's story is a best-case scenario fantasy, one where the powerful man chooses to dismantle his own power. For most, the system isn't so flexible. Yet the psychological core remains universally human. The research of Dr. Brené Brown and the principles of attachment theory aren't just clinical concepts, they are the bedrock of this narrative. Vulnerability is the birthplace of connection. A secure bond is the foundation of resilience. Elias Vance, a man who weaponized information, was ultimately felled by a simple, ancient truth: we are wired for connection. His fortress mentality was a pathology. Amara's lullaby was the antidote. The lingering question isn't whether they lived happily ever after. It's whether the price of that peace was a moral compromise. Did Amara, by choosing to stay and rebuild with him, become complicit in laundering a legacy of crime through acts of present-day charity? Or did she enact a more profound justice, not by destroying a broken man, but by holding him accountable to a new standard daily for the rest of his life? She didn't send him to prison, she sentenced him to goodness. Which is the more effective reform? This story ultimately isn't about a nanny and a crime boss. It's about the transformative, destabilizing power of authentic care in a world that often rewards its opposite. It's about the terrifying risk of softening and the revolutionary act of choosing trust over control. The most dangerous man in the city wasn't undone by a rival or the FBI. He was disarmed by a melody, by a child's trust, and by the courageous, steady presence of a woman who refused to be either a victim or a weapon. In the end, the greatest threat to his empire wasn't violence, it was peace. If this exploration of power, vulnerability, and the lines we cross for connection resonated with you, then you're exactly why I make these documentaries. I pour my heart into finding these human stories within the headlines and the tropes. If you want to help me keep telling them, please take 1 second to hit the subscribe button. It's free for you and it means the world to me. Let me know in the comments, was this a love story or a cautionary tale? Where do you stand on the moral math of Elia's redemption? And tell me where you're listening from. Thank you for watching, for thinking, and for questioning the stories we're told. Remember, the most powerful forces in the world aren't always bullets and billions. Sometimes they're a lullaby, a choice to stay, and the fragile, incredible courage to build a new thing from the broken pieces of the old. What song is disarming you?